Hi, this is Heather Estes, and I'm the teacher for the U.S. History class from the Civil War to present day. Here's what we did in class on May 6, 2020, and we're going to finish up our Civil Rights Movement unit with our projects due next week. So here's what we did in class. Okay, so we were going into our presentation again, and we also checked out our notes together. So we didn't get very far in our notes packet, but we talked really quickly about the Jim Crow laws, how African American culture blossomed, the civil rights movement within the Cold War era, and then really what an impact television makes in the American people's culture at that time. We finished up Brown versus Board of Education and the way that really started to affect how segregation became illegal. Segregation, we know, being separating of the cultures of African American people versus basically everybody else. So we went on to talk about the bus boycott and what that looked like. And there's our friend Rosa Parks here. So let's go back into our PowerPoint and check this out. This is all on Canvas for you at any time. These are things we talked about the previous week, and obviously separate but equal was not true. We'll go back to this poll tax information later on. Okay, we talked about all of these cool things the week before, and I'll get to where we left off. So the timeline here into Board of Education, here we go. They won the court case. School integration becomes something that occurs. So then we looked at the Little Rock 9, which was Little Rock, Arkansas, where they first started to integrate courses for high school students with African American students and white students. Obviously didn't go very smoothly, involving everyone, including the military, in order for them to go to school safely. So thank God we don't have to deal with that now. All right, so we checked out our timeline throughout the notes, and you'll notice in the very back of your notes here was a completed timeline at the end. So we didn't have time to actually finish this in class, so I'm going to go over that with you at the very end of our time. Okay, so we talked about in the early 1950s, the bus system, especially in the South, was created so that the priority was given to white customers, white people, whether they were women or men. So in 1955, a woman named Rosa Parks was on her way home after a long day at work. African Americans had to sit at the back of the bus. They were able to really sit anywhere, but then when a white person, such as this dude right here, would come on, they would be forced to stand up and give up their seat so that they could have their own spot. Now, we talked about Rosa Parks, but there were many other people, including her, that stood up against these kinds of laws or regulations. And it wasn't just her, of course, but she became this face of this movement for the boycott. So I won't read word for word the PowerPoint because you can go and check it out for yourself. But we finished up our notes with Rosa Parks here being one of many leaders in a movement. And the bus boycott ended segregation in transportation. And there's a really cool quote here from her. People always say that I didn't give up my seat because I was tired, but that isn't true. I was not tired physically. No, I was only tired. The only tired I was tired of giving in. So something we didn't answer as a class, but why would she be known as the mother of the civil rights movement? So she became almost a person who they kept talking about as, we don't want to have this system like her. We want to make sure we stand up for our rights. And it was something that became popular to talk about with her as the face of the movement, including, of course, Dr. Martin Luther King. So here is pretty much a whole page, including some of his very famous words in I Have a Dream speech. So we moved on in our PowerPoint here through the bus boycott. Move down. Okay. Oops, excuse me. There we go. Okay, I'm sorry. So the bus boycott was here in the South. The bus system did have this problem throughout the country, but it really focused on the part of the southern states here, including Montgomery, Alabama, where that was occurring. We had the bus segregation knocked out in 1956 because there was a boycott where people stopped using the buses for 13 months and they finally won out. There's a beautiful video of Rosa Parks here. We had to skip it because of time, but I encourage you to check this out. And we added more to our timeline. So, encouraged by Dr. Martin Luther King, African Americans protested unfair treatment through passive resistance. This means that there was non-violent protests involved. We saw that Dr. King was inspired by Gandhi, who was from India. He worked to have passive resistance against his government for change as well. And he noticed how well that worked. And so it began to be something that they would really encourage for equal rights for all people, but equal rights for African Americans specifically in that time. So in here we added our notes. Dr. King believed in the power of nonviolent protests. The African American community decided to boycott the bus system in that situation. They carpooled or walked wherever they needed to go. The boycott lasted 13 months, over a year, and then Supreme Court declared segregation on public transportation illegal in 1956. So we had the Brown versus Board of Education making school segregation illegal. Now slowly it's becoming part of all of society. Here we see it in the transportation industry too. So this leads to the March on Washington. In 1963, about 250,000 people participated in the March on Washington in support of equal rights for African Americans. The protesters wanted to show Congress their support of the Civil Rights Bill that President Kennedy was trying to pass. On the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Dr. Martin Luther King gave his famous I Have a Dream speech, and we had a student read this in class. I wanted to bring this to your attention. We didn't get to speak about this too much, but I want to have you go back and check if you're looking through this now. What does this make you think or feel about? Does this make you think that his dream actually came true? Or do we still have problems today? I'm curious of what you think. You can type it in the comments or you can reach out to me individually. That would be cool. But I'm just thinking, after reading through or listening to his speech through a video, I wonder what you think about this, because it is a beautiful speech. But did his actual dream come true? We'll have to think about that together. Okay, moving on. We had a lot to cover last class, and unfortunately we didn't make it all through. We added more to our timeline. That's a huge group of people. That's that March on Washington. You'll know the Washington Monument in the background, the reflection pool. Beautiful. Okay, so here in the middle is President JFK, President John F. Kennedy. The protesters wanted to do a nonviolent protest so that they would get the attention of Congress along with the president. They were trying to pass this civil rights bill that would make segregation illegal across the country, wherever you were, no matter what you were doing. And the civil rights bill, like I said, where it was going to outlaw segregation everywhere. So this is his I Have a Dream speech. It was televised for everyone to see and hear. You can see that. There's some really great videos of that as well. Unfortunately, John F. Kennedy did not see the Civil Rights Act passed. He was assassinated November 22nd, 1963. And then it was actually televised as well. Another huge event televised for all to see. A thing that was really socially making the country very difficult to live in at the time. So Lyndon B Johnson, you can see him getting sworn in here with Jackie Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's wife, and he becomes the new president. Now he actually does pass that civil rights bill, and he makes sure that he passes a lot of bills in the Senate and the Congress with them about civil rights and voting and all kinds of things. We saw the 24th Amendment here, that we'll skip over the voting information, but basically that you had to pay a tax in order to vote. You also had to pass a reading test, a literacy test, in order to vote. So here's a cartoon that says, here, come in and vote if you can afford it, and all the people that couldn't at the time. So this becomes illegal now. We added that to our timeline. A quote from President Johnson at the time: "It is wrong, deadly wrong, to deny any of your fellow Americans the right to vote in this country." So now, a huge win, not only for African Americans, for poor people, for people that are across the country that didn't think their vote mattered. This is now bringing more people to the polls, and more people have a choice in what they do for their country. a cool video. Again, we had to skip over because of time, but MLK Jr. there. Another thing we added to our timeline, Thurgood Marshall, who was a very prominent lawyer at the time. President Johnson he appointed him as Supreme Court Justice, the first African American to serve in this position. Served for a long time, 24 years. This is information we started to add to our notes. Let me back up a bit. There's John F. Kennedy here, Lyndon B Johnson. So adding into our notes, we said Lyndon B Johnson was sworn in as the president, continued John F. Kennedy's work. So these are some things that were occurring very quickly, and in the one term that President Johnson held as president, these were all things that occurred during that time very quickly. 24th Amendment, you did not have to pay money to vote anymore. The Civil Rights Act was passed. All segregation is illegal. You could go to any park, museum, restaurant, movie theater, anything, and segregation was not legal. So people had to follow that, even unwillingly, but they had to follow it. It was now law. And then also the Voting Rights Act. You didn't have to read to vote. You didn't have to pass a literacy test. Any person that's a citizen of the United States could vote for their choice in elections. So this affected a lot of people. We saw Thurgood Marshall here, the first African American Supreme Court judge appointed by President Johnson here. And then something you may not know about, just because the African American groups were very prominent in the civil rights movement, we have to remember that there were other people that were also affected positively with this movement, including people like Cesar Chavez, who is an activist who helped farm workers, especially in California, in the Southwest as well. He fought for better pay and equal rights. He brought on the unions, unionizing for the farm workers, meaning they didn't have to work in horrible conditions. They were hoping for education for people so that farm workers were not forgotten about at that time as well. Okay, so something to add. And sadly, we also had what were called assassinations of the 1960s. A very scary time to live where our leaders were not guaranteed their life. So assassination means a famous killing in public. John F. Kennedy, JFK, was killed in 1963, riding in a car in Dallas, Texas. Dr. Martin Luther King, MLK, was killed in 1968. He was on a balcony in Memphis, Tennessee, and it sparked violence and riots. Really sad because Dr. Martin Luther King, we know, supported non-violent protests. So it's very sad that it became violent after that. And then JFK's brother, Robert Kennedy, or Bobby Kennedy, he was killed in a 1968 shooting. He was running for president at the time. So not only did JFK die, but his own brother was killed as well. Many people were afraid at that time. They thought that there was a lot of unrest in the U.S. So to end our notes in this, and I'll go to our timeline after that and we'll finish up, the 1960s was a very violent time, but do you think that peaceful protests, why were they led by Dr. Martin Luther King? Why do you think they made a difference among all of the violence? Something to think about and remember. The peaceful protests were the most effective. The bus boycott, it became illegal to segregate in 1 year or less. The boycotting of the farm workers from Cesar Chavez, that was huge. It wasn't violence that sparked change, but non-violence. So this is a very messy timeline, I apologize, but to finish up here, our civil rights movement timeline. So we have the Jim Crow laws that were enacted right after the Civil War, and they were still in place until the 1960s. So things started to change. Brown versus Board of Education, segregation no more in education. The bus boycott, 1955, 1956, now no segregation on buses. 1963, March on Washington. President Johnson had to become president because JFK was killed. 1964, the 24th Amendment was enacted. That means the Civil Rights Bill was enacted as well, and you no longer had to pay money to vote. 1965, Voting Rights Act was enacted. No longer had to read to vote. We had 1967, Thurgood Marshall is now a Supreme Court judge, first African American judge. And now 1968, we had not only MLK assassinated, but Bobby Kennedy, who was running for president, also assassinated. 1968, a scary time for that tape. So boys and girls, this is something I want you to remember, but not just to fill your notes with your pages here, but something to think about, that this movement created a lot of change in our country, good and sometimes bad. But thinking about, people that were affected by this and how we had to now learn from these changes, this is how it sparked violence throughout the country, but really, was the violence something that brought people together? No. It was something that divided the country. So think about it. As you can see, the 1960s was a very violent time. Think about those peaceful protests and how much they made a difference instead of the violence. So that's basically our class from last week. Hi again. Sorry for the long video, but just to note, this is all occurring very quickly. There was so much change that happened in the 1960s, especially in the late 1960s. So when we think about this time, it's happening in the same time as the Cold War. And not only that, but this specific time of the Civil Rights Movement happened within the Vietnam War, and before that, the Korean War. So all of this is happening not only around the world, but to here at home in America too. So it really makes you think of how much change occurred in such a short time, and how we really are still being affected by it today as well, good and bad. So some things to think about, and we have our projects due next week, so I can't wait to see how you've learned about this Cold War period and the civil rights era and what that meant to you. I am so excited to learn more together with you, and we'll continue on the rest of the Cold War era and into the present day. So a lot to learn in a short time. We're going to do it together. Hope you have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.